Hello everyone and welcome to Understanding a Stitch Part 1. We are so excited to have you tuning in with us today. A few announcements before we get going. You can post questions that you have in the questions pane anytime throughout the presentation. That's on the control panel to the right side of your screen. Also, this webinar is being recorded for you. I'd like to introduce our presenter for today, Bernina Educator Debbie Cacciamani.
Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Debbie and this is Understanding a Stitch Part 1. And I'm very excited to bring this to you. This is a lesson, a little bit mechanical, a little bit technical on how your stitch is actually created. And I think that's an important lesson for all of us to know so that we can help our machine be as best as it can be for what we would like it to produce for us as far as how our stitches look. So we're going to learn how a stitch is actually created and how you can make the right choices to enhance your stitch quality. So we'll start here. The hook. The hook is the heart of a sewing machine. This is a picture of what the Bernina hook looks like. It sits inside of your machine and it's the thing that makes your stitch interlock your top thread with your bottom thread. All of our Bernina hooks are made of metal, not plastic. There are some hooks out there that are made of plastic. Our hooks are robotically milled and hand polished. And this speaks to the quality of what Bernina expects. They're very attuned to how the stitches look, and they want to make very sure that it is up to your standards. This hook rides smooth and quiet. It is our latest hook development. We've had, let's see, 2 new hooks since 2008, and this is the second one. It's kind of an evolution of the first one. The first hook that came out in 2008 was born on the Bernina 830. And now that machine as a sister machine is the 880. And these 2 hooks are just a little bit different from each other. The 880 hook is a rotary hook, and it spins to the back of the machine because it is an industrial hook. It moves faster than any other machine on the market at 1,200 stitches per minute for a standard type sewing machine. The hook you're looking at on the screen is for our 7 series, 5 series, and 4 series models. And this is called the Bernina hook. And it, like I said, it's the evolution of the 8 series hook that came out in 2008. What I want you to notice is the point that the arrow is pointing at. That is called the hook point. It is created to a specific dimension because that's the point that grabs your top thread and interlocks it with your bobbin thread. So this is a picture of the hook once it's inside of your machine. It is a front-loading vertical hook position. All Bernina machines have hooks as a vertical hook position. Some machines out there have the drop-in bobbins. I'm sure you've all seen them. And those hooks sit horizontal. Bernina chooses to make their hooks sit vertical because they feel they get the most precise stitch this way. I'm going to tell you more about that in a minute. Your bobbin case fits right into the middle of that hook. So this next picture is a picture of the hook from underneath the stitch plate. So you will see there's a picture of the needle with red thread coming down the front of the needle. There's a loop of thread, and then that hook tip that we pointed to 2 slides ago, it has grabbed that loop that's behind the needle. And this is how it works. So the needle drops below the stitch plate. There's a loop that forms on the back side of the needle. The hook spins from underneath, and that hook grabs that loop. That loop is then pulled down underneath around your bobbin case, interlocks your top thread and your bobbin thread, and pulls it back to the base of the stitch plate, and that's how your stitch is created. There's a little more detail we're going to learn about here though, because if you look at that hook, you can't really tell from this picture, but the distance from the front of that hook where it grabs the thread to the back side of the needle is a distance of 0.05 millimeters. Now I know a millimeter is like a random measurement, but the reality is 0.05 millimeters is a very, very, very small distance. And so when we talk about needles in a little bit, we're going to talk about this distance can have an effect on what your stitch looks like, because if your needle is bent, 0.05 millimeters is an awfully small space for something to go sideways. So if you understand that the distance from the needle to the hook is that close, that's what gives you precise stitches. That's what gives you that Bernina precision that we all know and love. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to see a Bernina Hook video. It is a video by Bernina International. It is starts out with some pretty stitches, and then it goes to like a bunch of different mechanical parts kind of pulling together. And what I want you to notice when we get to the end of the video, it's only just under 2 minutes long. When we get to the end of that video, you'll see all the parts come together that look kind of like the inside of a sewing machine without a cover. And then you'll see that the hook is spinning and the bobbin is spinning. And that's the part I want you to pay attention to, because that's what we're going to talk about coming up. So Megan.
Bernina has developed a world first that makes it possible to sew with up to 9 millimeters stitch width. Even further, without stopping, and with the highest precision. All this at a higher speed and quieter than before. The clever inventions ensure intuitive and simpler handling, and are made of superior materials, designed to last. The new centerpiece of Bernina unites the advantages of the two best hook technologies. The centrally placed driver, with 2 oscillating cam lobes, ensures higher precision and smooth running at 1,000 stitches per minute. The bobbin can hold more thread than our standard bobbins. And every piece that comes into contact with the thread is made of superior materials. The new Bernina Hook, premiering in the 7 series. Now at your local Bernina store. Bernina, made to create.
Okay, so did you see what I mean? How that hook spins so fast, and all of those parts have to be timed exactly. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of those next, especially your sewing machine needles, because this is something we have control over, and it makes a big difference in how your stitches turn out, deciding what needle to use and what size needle to use. So in general, there are 3 types of needles. Sharp, microtext kind of meets in with that, ballpoint or jersey needles, and universal needles. These are 3 general groups. There are several different types within each group. There's a variety of sizes from very small needles with a smaller eye, a size 60, up to a 120, which is a very big needle, a larger, with a larger eye. So let's talk about how to choose the right needle for the job at hand. But first, we're going to do a poll question.
Debbie, the poll is out there.
Thank you.
All right, it looks like you had 54% say sharp or microtext needles, 44% said universal, and only 2% said ballpoint or jersey needles.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. So let's talk about why the type of needle really matters. So we'll start with the sharp needles. There are a variety of different types of sharp needles. A denim needle is sharp. A microtext has a sharper, finer point than a regular sharp. There are several others. These sharp needles cut through the fabric. They actually cut right through your fabric weave. A ballpoint needle pushes the fabric weave side to side. So if your fabric, for example, wasn't cut on the straight of grain, which a lot of times that's the case, the ballpoint needle has a rounded tip, a rounded point, and so it would roll to one side of the fabric weave, and maybe the next stitch it might roll to the other side of the fabric weave. A universal needle is a kind of a blend of both. So when you decide what kind of needle to use, what type, you need to consider what is your fabric, because this is the deciding factor. If your fabric is a woven fabric, then use a sharp needle. It will cut through it, it won't damage the fabric, and it will give you a straight stitch and more precise stitching overall. If your fabric has any little bit of stretch fabric in it, lycra, spandex, anything, a knit fabric, then always use a ballpoint needle, because if you cut through with a sharp needle, if you cut through a fabric that has stretch in it, it cuts the weave of that stretch and will unravel it for you, and that's not a good look. And then universal needles are the needles that I use least often, because they are a kind of blend. They're not exactly sharp, and they're not exactly a true ballpoint either. And so those needles are for the times when I'm not sure what my fabric content is. So probably just like all of you, I have a whole stash of fabric, most of which I know what they are made of, what kind of fabric they are. But you know, there are times when I'll look at something and I go, I wonder if this has a little bit of stretch in it, and I wonder if I should use a universal needle. So those of you who use universal needles more than any other, you might want to consider a different type of needle based upon what fabric you're using. So choose the needle type based on the fabric. Then let's talk about the needle size. You choose the needle size based on the weight of your thread. So for example, if you have a heavier weight cotton thread, for example, that you might need to use a larger eye needle. If you have a lighter weight thread, then you can use a smaller eye needle, right? The reason is because if the thread is too big for the size of the needle, the thread doesn't fit into the groove of the needle as well. And so that causes friction between your needle and your thread, and it could cause your thread to snap. And so make sure that if you have a larger weight of thread, that you would use a larger eye needle, larger size needle. So you might want to look at your straight stitch. Is it straight, or do you have little pushes of fabric left or right? And maybe that's the type of needle that's causing that problem. So this is a graphic of what that might be like. So if I had this yellow piece of fabric and I was sewing along and I was using a universal needle, for example, and I'm sewing along, but then the needle kind of isn't sharp, so it's not going to cut through and go straight down that line. It might move to the other side of that weave line. And then it might look like, oh, one stitch looks a little bit wing this way or a little wing that way. And you wonder what really causes that problem. It could be the type of needle that you're using. So universal needles can cause that, just so you're aware. Sharp needles will not. And that would be on a woven fabric. Ballpoint needles are for your fabrics with a stretch in them. So now we need poll question number 2.
Okay, Debbie, the poll is open.
Thank you.
All right, we had some interesting results on this one.
Tell me.
39% said about every 4 to 6 hours of sewing time. 37% said at the beginning of every project. 17% said whenever I remember, and 8% said when the needle breaks.
Okay, well, most of you seem to have this all figured out. So let me get my PowerPoint back up here. Most of you seem to have it figured out. Here's the deal. If you sew on a regular basis, then the best thing is to consider how long is your project. So if I start a large quilting project, for example, I might be working on that for several days or even weeks. And so there may be, you might change your needle at the beginning of the project, but you might also have to change it toward the middle or toward the end. So needles become damaged. They're just machine needles. And they are the least expensive thing you can do to make your machine behave well. So a damaged needle looks something like what you see on the screen. One of these needles has a flat bottom and the other one on the right-hand side has a bent needle tip. Either way, it's going to damage your fabric or make your stitches look very weird. So it's important for you to change your needles 4 to 6 hours of sewing time in general. If your needle is a titanium needle, those last about 3 times longer. So just so you're aware that those do have a longer shelf life, sewing time. And so this is just a picture of what can happen if your needle is damaged. So we have symptoms of a bad needle. Those are things like your thread is starting to shred or snap. And that just means that it probably has a burr, or it's got something wrong with it that it's going to shred your thread. Maybe your stitches are starting to look just wrong or incorrect somehow. Change the needle. If you see loops on the top or the bottom, sometimes that's caused by burrs on the needle, so change it. Skip stitches are a sign of a bad needle. And popping sounds or ticking sounds while you sew are a sign of a bad needle. So popping sounds generally happen when the point of the needle is flat or dull. Sometimes that happens pretty quickly with certain kinds of projects. So for example, if you're doing embroidery and you're using a heavyweight kind of stabilizer, and all of that thickness will cause your needle to dull faster. Also, when you're quilting with the 3 layers, your top and your back and your batting, going through batting really dulls your needle. So if you're doing a large quilting project, you might have to change your needle every 3 to 4 hours. So pay attention to how your stitches look and how your machine sounds, because that's going to give you the clues to what's going on. Now, if you hear ticking sounds, that's a different game. Ticking sounds means that your needle is bent or your needle has a burr on it. There's something amiss in the point of the needle, because that ticking sound means that your needle is hitting the hook. And now that you know that the distance between the needle and that hook is only 0.05 millimeters, literally a sheet of paper, that's really small. If your needle is bent, you're going to start hearing those kind of ticking sounds. Just sometimes you can't even tell that it's bent. But if you hear that noise, that's what's happening. So now we're going to talk a little bit about bobbins and bobbin thread. So our current bobbins in the 8 series, 7 series, 5 series, and 4 series are these jumbo bobbins that you see on the left-hand side. Our 3 series machine still has the smaller bobbins that you see on the right-hand side. The larger bobbins hold about 70% more thread than the bobbin on the right-hand side. So what kind of thread do you put on that bobbin? So there are bobbin threads out there, a whole variety of brands and types, and you can use any of those if you like. Bobbin threads are generally lighter weight, so they would be 60 weight, 80 weight, 100 weight. The higher that number, the thinner the thread. So you can fit a lot of thread on these jumbo bobbins if they are those lighter weight threads. So which one do you choose? It's a personal choice. If you want to use a lighter weight bobbin thread, know that the weight of your bobbin thread compared to the weight of your top thread changes how those 2 threads interact in creating your stitch. Just logically, that's the way it works. If your top thread is really heavy and your bobbin thread is really light, there will be a difference in how your stitch looks. So be discerning. Take a look at your stitches, the top side, the bottom side. Make sure they look the way that you want. Always, always test sew, because I think that's something that we kind of skip sometimes. We just get right to it. But I think it's important to do a little testing with the fabric, the needle, the thread that you plan to use for your project. But the weight of the thread will matter in how your stitch looks, and that is something we control. So the next thing I want to talk about is the feed dog system. The feed dogs are those teeth underneath your presser foot that pull your fabric to the back of the machine while you sew. We're going to talk a little bit about those. There are 2 different types of feed dog systems. One is called a box feed and one is called an elliptical feed. So the box feed system moves mechanically in the shape of a box. That's why it's called that. So what happens is your feed dogs come up underneath the foot and and match with your presser foot. Move to the back, drop back down, move to the front in the shape of a box. That's why it's called that. Okay, the box feed dog system is a stronger grip on your fabric because the full set of feed dogs come up together to match the presser foot and pull your fabric to the back. With this type of feed dog system, you can easily sew through 20, 25 layers of fabric. Know that all Bernina machines have a box feed dog system, even the little baby machines, all of them. And so let me just show you how this works. In the box form, it goes just like that. Full thing comes up, pulls your fabric to the back. The elliptical feed system is exactly what you might think. It moves in the shape of an ellipse. And so there is one point where the feed dogs come up, touch the bottom of the fabric, match with your foot, and then drop back off because it moves in the shape of an ellipse, like this. So here's the bottom line. With a box feed system, all you have to do is fingertip sew. You don't have to push or pull your fabric, just fingertip sew left and right. You guide, the machine takes the fabric and moves it according to how it needs to for the stitch you've selected. There are box feed systems on all brands of machines, but there are no elliptical feed systems on a Bernina. We stick with the box feed system because that gives you the most control over your fabric and the most power. So the next thing we want to talk about is a thing called the take-up lever. The take-up lever is something that you thread when you thread the top of your machine every time. You just don't know it's called that. It is this lever that is right there in the yellow circle on the front of the machine. It is behind that silver bar, and that's the one that moves, the lever that moves up and down while you sew. That's called the take-up lever. The purpose of a take-up lever is when the needle drops below the stitch plate and the thread goes around your bobbin. The take-up lever is the part that pulls that bobbin thread up and helps lock it with the feed dogs. The take-up lever actually looks like this, a close-up view, and this is an important part of the whole process of creating a stitch. The next thing that really matters is what presser feet you might use. So I just took a picture of several presser feet that have a different kind of shape on the bottom. Because what you need to understand is that the part of the foot that matters the most is the part that touches your fabric. And the bottom of the feet are all made differently for a particular reason. There are feet for normal sewing motion. There are feet for forward and backward and sideways motion. And there are some feet for special sewing techniques. We're going to learn more about some of those things next week in our second part of this lesson. So let's do a review. How is a stitch actually created? The needle drops below the stitch plate. A loop is formed on the back of the needle. The hook spins and the hook point grabs the thread loop. The thread is pulled straight down around the bobbin and interlocks with the bobbin thread. The take-up lever pulls the threads up together, and the feed dog system moves the fabric to the back, and that's the motion that locks the top and the bottom threads together. The thing I find absolutely amazing about all this is that all of those different steps happen with every stitch. Think about how fast that happens. Our machines go 1,000 stitches a minute, and the 880 goes 1,200 stitches per minute at full speed. And all of this happens during that one stitch. It's incredible, really, when you think about it. What we expect as consumers is that all of our stitches are perfect, right? That's what we all want. We're all perfectionists. We all want to be in control of everything. And the machine is in control of the actual stitch formation, right? The only things we can control are what foot are we using? What kind of thread are we using? Is it the right size and weight thread for the size of the needle that I want to use? What about the feed dogs? What about, is the hook spinning right? Am I doing everything I can to make sure that on my end, I'm making this work as perfect as possible? Did you know there's about 1,000 moving parts in some of our high-end machines during any stitch formation? 1,000? And all of those have to kind of match and meld magically together. Everything has to be timed to an exact moment to make this all work. And it makes me excited that I'm able to teach you all of these different things. So I'm hoping that this will help you just have an easier time deciding how you can help. So I want you to take control, because our job is to do all that we can to make this process go smoothly. Choosing the right needle based on the fabric you are using, deciding what top or bobbin thread will be the best option for you, trying out different presser feet to decide what looks the best to you. And please don't forget to test sew. I find it really important that really makes a difference in how your stitches will turn out. So the hook, that's the heart of your sewing machine. Take care of it, it's priceless. The needle you choose will affect the stitch, so choose wisely. Your bobbin thread will also affect the stitch. And your presser feet, yeah, they matter too. So next week, July 2nd, part 2 of understanding a stitch, we're going to work on things like how to fine-tune your stitch using your machine settings, what stitches might look best when you use the correct presser foot, and how about creating some new stitches just because you can, because what we do is just really all about the fun. Any questions, Megan?
Yes, we do have a few questions for you. First, is it more important to choose the needle size by the thread weight or by the weight of the fabric itself?
I think in the end, I think partly both, but the needle size, the needle type is based more upon the fabric. The size is partly on the fabric, but mostly your thread goes through the eye of that needle. And if your needle eye is too small for the weight of your thread, you're not going to have a happy experience. I actually had a gal that I talked to at an event a number of years ago, and she was complaining that her machine was bad because it was breaking thread. And once I questioned her about what needle was she using and what thread was she using, it was really because she was using a small needle with a heavier weight thread. And the two they just caused too much friction, and there was snapping and breaking happening. She did have the opportunity to call me if that didn't solve the problem, but that solved the problem. So I think it's a little bit of both, but I really think you got to think about the weight of your thread.
Yes, definitely. Another question, can the hook be damaged by the needle hitting it a lot?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Yes, if the hook is, the hook can get damaged by a needle hitting it. It would get scratched. It might cause a burr in the hook. And if there's a burr on your hook, then when it spins, it would affect the bobbin thread, and you could actually have bobbin thread ripping issues because you might get a scratch or a burr on your hook. So that's why anytime you hear that ticking noise, that you change the needle right away, because you do not want your needle to cause a problem by putting a scratch or a burr on your hook system. So yes, that can happen for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's something you just have to listen for and be aware of before it get too bad. Yes. Let's see. This one might be no, this is a good question. The Q24 manual says to check the bobbin tension each time you change the bobbin. You know, there's the box, the tension box. Do you recommend measuring the tension this way on domestic machines too?
Oh, that's an interesting question. On the Q series, which is our quilting machines, for those of you who don't know, the 24-inch and 20-inch quilting machines, it's those machines are mechanically designed a bit different, and so those always have to have their bobbin tension checked. On our 8 series machines, the bobbin tension is preset at the factory. When you open the door, there are 2 small white, silver or white dots that are matched from the factory for the correct bobbin tension for regular sewing. And you will know that because on the bobbin door of an 8 series machine, there's a picture of a bobbin and a little red mark that tells you if those 2 dots should be behind each other directly, or if one should be off 1 click left or off 1 click right. Mostly they are right behind each other when you get a machine that's an 8 series. On the 7 series, 5 series, and 4 series machines, there is no way for us as consumers to change the bobbin tension. There are the black bobbin case that comes in the box with the machine is preset at the factory, and it's fine for all general sewing. If you feel like you need a way to change the bobbin tension for a specific technique, let's say, for example, you wanted to do bobbin work with very, very heavy cord or something in your bobbin, then you would get a red bobbin case to go with your machine. If you have a machine that you would like a higher bobbin tension that would pull the top thread down more, that would be a gold bobbin case. And people use those for like high speed things, like if you were doing stitch regulation work at higher speeds, or if you were doing embroidery at full speed, then you might want a high tension bobbin case, and those are gold. So instead of changing the bobbin case tension, there are 3 options: a standard, a red bobbin case for bobbin work for looser tensions, and a gold bobbin case for high tension. So that those would be your choices. You don't ever really have to check the bobbin tension on the standard bobbin case like you would on a Q series machine. Thank you for the question.
Awesome. We have a couple more questions.
Okay.
Let me narrow it down. If someone, again, these are your recommendations, Debbie. If someone is sewing generally with a polyester 40 weight thread, what needle size would you recommend for that?
Sorry, could you read that again?
They are generally sewing with a polyester 40 weight thread. What needle would you recommend, or needle size?
Okay, for that size of thread, I would generally use an 80, and depending on what type of fabric, would it be a ballpoint or would it be a sharp of some kind, depending on the type of fabric that you might be using. That's a very basic sewing thread, and usually a size 80 works great for that size, and I do use that weight of thread a lot. And I use the size 80, 12. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Besides Bernina needles, what type of needle or brand of needle do you recommend?
Okay. There's a whole host of brands out there. I have a drawer full of all different things. So I would just try, they all kind of are good needles. I have very few brands that I don't prefer, but those are just personal preference. So like I said, I use Schmetz and Superior and Bernina and all different ones. So, you can choose any one that you like.
Yes, definitely. Could you talk a little bit more, or do you notice a difference between titanium versus chrome needles?
I have some chrome needles, and when I sew with them, I don't really see a whole lot of difference from those to titanium. The biggest thing I think is the length of time that you can use them. And I wish I had the time to time out everything that I do, but I don't. So I use them until they don't work for me, and then I pitch them and go to another needle. So I don't really see a whole lot of length of time difference between them.
All right. And I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions here.
Okay.
Can there be problems caused by using a thread that is smaller than the needle eye?
Yes. If your needle eye is too big and your thread is very thin, then the thread can kind of wiggle through the size of the loop of the hole in the needle eye, and it could get it wouldn't hold it quite tight enough, and so you could get loops from that kind of experience. And that's just something that you would need to test though, to see if it's going to work for you depending on what your fabric is. But yeah, you can, like if you used a large, like a top stitch needle has a bigger eye and it's a longer eye. And if that thread moves up and down within the eye, it can change how your stitches look. So that's a good question. And yes, it can have an effect. So that's why you need to kind of match your thread with your needle.
All right. And this is a kind of specific question, but I'm sure applies to several people probably watching. Should you use a ballpoint needle on t-shirts, like even when embroidering? I mean, should you always be using a ballpoint needle on t-shirts?
The answer is yes. T-shirts are a jersey knit generally, and you should really use a ballpoint needle if you're using your sewing machine. If you're using an overlocker, they have some different needles that you can use, but on a sewing machine, if you're making a t-shirt, then a ballpoint needle, because otherwise what will happen is if you try to use a sharp needle or that the ballpoint would be the best choice, because if it cuts the weave of your fabric, then your t-shirt's gonna get holes in it, and that's not a good look. So you probably could get away with a universal needle in some of these instances. Just be aware, because the universal kind of goes both ways, but the goal is for your stitches to look the best they can look. And so choosing specifically a ballpoint needle is a better choice.
All right, I lied. One more question, because I think it came up last time, and so I think we should talk about it again this time. When you're talking, between your top thread and your bobbin thread, is it better to match the type? So say you're using a cotton or like a polyester thread, is it better to match the bobbin and top thread, or does it matter?
It will change how your stitches look if you change the type of thread that you have on your top versus your bobbin. So when I learned to sew, my mom always said, whatever you put on the top, you're going to put on the bobbin, because then your stitch is balanced. And so I've always done it that way, but that doesn't mean you have to. So yeah, I think some people match exactly, some people don't. And there really isn't a right or a wrong. It's a matter of preference. So you just have to be discerning, look at your stitches and say, oh, I like how that looks, or oh no, that's not a good look. There's something I gotta change. And now that you understand how the stitch is actually formed, then you might be able to figure out much easier what I need to change to make it work better for me.
Okay, perfect. Any final words, Debbie?
I would just say thank you, everyone, for coming. And I hope I'll see you next week for our part 2, because we're going to have a little more fun.
Woohoo, awesome. Well, thank you, Debbie, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. In a couple of days, this recording will be available on bernina.com. You can click on the Learn and Create tab in the top right corner, and then click on Classes, and then Webinars. If you have any other questions, feel free to email me those, and I will pass those on to Debbie. On behalf of Bernina, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.